Unbeknownst to most people, the UN, the United Nations, is actively helping and supporting the millions of migrants coming up through Central America making their way to the US. Because you see, if you happen to be a migrant in South America and your goal is to make it to the United States, well, there are many different paths that you can take. South America is a huge continent, and depending on where you start from, there are many different routes that you can take to go up north. However, if you look at a map, you'll notice that all those different routes reach a choke point. This choke point is located near the border of Colombia and Panama, and it's called the Darien Gap. It's an area of land so inhospitable that building roads or building infrastructure there is nearly impossible, meaning it's a lawless area that you really want to avoid at all costs. But if you're a migrant coming to America, you have to go through this treacherous stretch of land in order to make your way up north, which is exactly why you see upwards of 10,000 people per day crossing the Darien Gap. But what's truly unexpected is what these migrants see after crossing over. The United Nations and their affiliated NGOs are waiting there in Panama on the other side of the gap, giving out food, prepaid cards, maps, as well as bus rides that take them from Panama all the way through Central America, all the way through Mexico, and up into the US via the US southern border. And so our team here at the Epoch Times, we went down there to Panama, to the area right after the Darien Gap, to expose exactly what the UN is up to down there. The culmination of that journey was this documentary right here called Weapons of Mass Migration. It's a phenomenal short film, and if you want to check it out, I'll throw a link to it. It'll be right there at the top of the description box below. However, today we speak with Mr. Joshua Phillip. He is the lead investigative researcher on that project, and he broke down for us exactly how the UN has weaponized mass migration, as well as what their ultimate agenda actually is. And so take a quick moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons and take a listen. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, pleasure. Thank you.
All right, to start with, I want to get you to introduce something. When people are coming from South America to the United States, they need to go through Central America. And as soon as they enter, there's a choke point located in Panama called the Darien Gap. To start with, maybe for the audience members who aren't aware of what it is, can you sort of describe what the Darien Gap actually is?
Yeah, so there's what's called the Pan American Highway. It goes all the way from Alaska, all the way down the west coast of the United States, all the way down through Central America, and of course actually goes all the way down into the southern tip of South America. The only place it's not connected is in the Darien Gap, which is the southernmost part of Panama. And it works as kind of the natural land bridge between Panama and, of course, Colombia, but also separates, of course, Central America from South America. It's interesting because, I mean, when I was down in Panama, it was incredible. The U.S. military had built so much there. They had built entire man-made lakes. They built the Panama Canal. The ability of the U.S. military to develop in Panama, including just, wonder of the world type stuff, incredible stuff, was really amazing to see. They could not build a road through the Darien Gap, just emphasizing how dangerous the Darien Gap is.
What is it physically? Is it like a gap of water or a gap of forest?
Mountains, cliffs, and thick, thick jungle.
How long is it?
I don't know the exact distance, but it's not that long. People say they can walk it in about 3 to 4 days.
Okay, so then what you're saying happens is people are making their way through South America. They go through Colombia. Pretty much as soon as they enter Panama, there's this gap that they then, whether they're in a bus or in a car, they have to disembark and walk up exactly. Jungles, mountains, through waterways.
Exactly. Okay. So I was actually down in Panama at the mouth of the Darien Gap, because right on the other side of it, that's where all the different migrant camps are. Right at the mouth of the Darien Gap, there are 4 different camps. These are run kind of in conjunction between Senafront, which is the Panamanian Border Patrol / military, and the United Nations. And that kind of became the focal point of a lot of the investigations, because people don't understand the role of the United Nations in this, that this is actually something much bigger.
Yeah, so in your documentary, what I really noticed was that as you're making your way around that village, which is right after the Darien Gap, there's a bunch of tents, buildings, offices, all with the UN logo or a logo of an NGO that's affiliated with the UN. What are those agencies doing there? And I guess what's the UN itself doing there?
That was one of the big findings I came across actually years ago. I was doing an investigation into, what's really facilitating mass migration to the United States, because you might remember, a few years ago, everyone was saying it's Texas. It's Texas loading people up on buses and they're shipping them all over the country. And, the question is, well, is that really the case? I decided to go to Texas myself and toured the whole border. I went into Mexico. And I'll be honest, when I was first going down there, what I expected to find was that the Mexican cartels were running the whole operation. I thought I was going to go down there and find, there's a handoff between the cartels and the people running the buses. And I wanted to just go find that. When I went down there, the places I went to had almost no cartel presence, at least some of them. I was told that, for example, Eagle Pass, that on the Mexico side, that the cartels were not really active, that you could basically cross right over. And when I was down there as well, I was told over and over again, no, it's being facilitated by the United Nations. The United Nations is running this, and they're working with various NGOs doing it. And there's a U.S. government program working with the United Nations on this. And I mean, to me, I was shocked. Like, I had trouble believing it at first. Like, I was like, what do you mean the United Nations? Like, it came out of left field, because everything I had been told up to that point was the cartels are running it, And so I go down there, and sure enough, you start seeing that, at least on the Mexico side, there's pamphlets all over the place, scattered on the ground right next to IDs and passports, and the United Nations and Mexico government, booklets telling them how to enter the United States. There's documents from the United Nations. Then I start talking to, for example, we spoke with the sheriff in Kinney County in Texas. And it's a small county in Texas that's dealing with just huge amounts of mass migration. They have high-speed chases several times a day. It takes the entire police force. Every officer he has is dealing with these high-speed chases to the extent that they can't deal with like normal crime anymore. They're so overwhelmed by this that they can't function as a law enforcement organization like they normally would. And so I asked him, like, well, what do you do when you arrest the people? He goes, oh, well, we have to hand them to these buses, and they drive them. I'm like, who runs the buses? He goes, I don't know. They won't tell me. The sheriff has to hand these people over to the buses, and they don't tell him who's running the buses. It's like, well, where are they taken to? He goes, I don't know.
Who's forcing the sheriffs to do this?
Well, that's what I asked. He said it's part of the government program. But he's not being told who these people are. He's not being told where they're bringing them. He's not being told who's running it. All he's told is that, again, just because of the federal regulations or whatever else, they have to hand them over. And that raised a whole lot of questions. What I uncovered the first time was that there's a government program where the State Department is communicating directly with an organization called the International Organization for Migration, of course tied in with the UN. There's government money going to it, and through this, State Department coordinates the operations, the United Nations runs it, and they go through various NGOs that facilitate the on-the-ground operations. So that's like the chain of command, basically. I exposed that in my first documentary and showing that, of course, U.S. tax dollars are paying for it. The one I just did, where I went into Panama and, of course, California and so on, looking into this even more, I wanted to find out what programs were directing it. Because, we kind of just peeled back the lid and got just a small glimpse of what's happening, but there's a lot of questions that aren't really answered, like what is actually happening? How is the whole thing being facilitated? What is the actual process going all the way from, South America and Darien Gap all the way up through these, other countries into the United States? And then, why are they busing people around the United States? Like, how does the operation run? And so that was the focus of this documentary.
I guess one of the reasons I was really taken aback by the footage you were able to capture of all these UN buildings and agencies right there is because, ultimately, like, once you kind of remove all the veneers that the media has put on it, it's illegal immigration. Like, these individuals, no matter how many there are, you said something crazy like 10,000 per day in this village right beyond the Darien Gap are,
just one of four, yeah.
That's nuts. The scale of it is insane. But even if you take away the scale, these individuals are breaking the law when crossing this border. They're about to break the law when going further and crossing the border into, I believe, Costa Rica. And so what is the UN actually doing there? I don't understand that.
So that was one of my big questions because, of course, you watched the documentary. We actually show a board from Senafront. Senafront is, again, Panamanian Border Patrol /military. They don't have an official military, but basically Border Patrol is their military, right? They run base, they have the gear and training and everything of a normal military. They're the ones who are the Border Patrol. They handle the security of the camps. They had a big board at one of the camps, and we filmed it, and it says on the board that it's illegal under Panama law to facilitate or aid or give comfort to people who are illegally immigrating. It is in violation of their law. And so that was a question I had. I was like, well, if it's against your law in this country, then Senefront board says it's against the law, but Senefront is, at least part of the security operations running this. And the answer I got when I questioned that was they say, well, it's because Panama is signed on with the Global Compact for Migration, that there's a United Nations agreement that the U.S. and Europe and most Latin American countries and African countries and Middle Eastern countries, they're all part of it. And this United Nations agreement, again, the Global Compact for Migration, is what has established this entire system of facilitating mass migration. It's run through the United Nations. They work with various NGOs, and the NGOs run the ground operations. The United Nations kind of plays the bigger facilitator role, but the governments in these countries also, because they're part of this agreement, have to facilitate it. And so in Panama, for example, the people who are illegally entering Panama, and they are illegally entering, they're not allowed to wander outside the camps. If they leave the camps, they get arrested. If they leave the camps, they're in violation of Panamanian law. And so after they come through the Darien Gap, they're sent directly to these camps, these NGO and United Nations camps. And as you saw in the documentary, they have UNICEF tents where they check them in and they get them registered and they get them in their books and so on. They load them up on buses and they don't let them go in Panama. They ship them to Costa Rica. And then Costa Rica ships them to Nicaragua, same exact program. They're not allowed to wander around the country. They load them up on buses and they ship them north. And that process continues until they hit Mexico. The Mexican government ships them north. Once they hit the U.S.-Mexico border, the cartels take over because the cartels run the border crossings. They have to pay the cartels money. If they don't pay them, the cartels kill them, right? Or they have to do work for the cartels, and they'll threaten their families and so on. After that, they stroll right across the border. As you saw, we have the whole thing on video. In fact, we actually gained access to the areas. They stroll right across the border, or they hop the border. They have climb ladders, everything, but there's just giant gaps they can just literally walk right through. As soon as they're over, they hand themselves in to Customs Border Protection, or they use the CBP One app, which is a U.S. government-run app where they can actually make appointments to surrender themselves, or the Biden administration will actually put them on planes and fly them to the United States. Mm-hmm. Once they hand themselves in, they take them, when they say arrests are up, what they really mean is this. They arrest them. Then they take them to what are called processing facilities. That's between CBP, Customs Border Protection, and Department of Homeland Security. At the processing facilities, up to 72 hours, because they can't hold them longer than 72 hours, they process them. They get them enrolled on the wait list for amnesty. And because of that, by either giving them amnesty wait list or they're also giving them parole, that makes them eligible for all these government handouts. They also give them airplane tickets. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, gives them airplane tickets to anywhere they want to go. They load them up on buses, and then they release them on the streets of the United States. And that is how the system works.
Well, I wanted to just backtrack a little bit back to Central America, because I know that the Global Compact for Migration, it doesn't actually override the border policies of individual sovereign states, right? And so going from Panama up to the United States, there's 5 separate nations, right? After you leave Panama, there's Costa Rica, then you get to Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and that's all before then you reach Mexico. I guess my 2 questions would be, 1, why did these nations sign on to the Global Compact at all? Like, what was in it for them? And B, why are they allowing their country to be used in this route?
Yeah, so that was one of the questions I had as well. And so in the documentary, we actually got an interview, a very hard to get interview with the former head of Senefront. Right? This is the guy in charge of the whole show. And even though he's a former position on that, he's still an advisor to the president. So, this is a top-level official in Panama who's at the head of the organization on the Panama side that's kind of, having to deal with it. They raised some concerns, including they believe that the NGOs and the United Nations are undermining the sovereignty of their own country. They say that if they, for example, begin enforcing laws, that the NGOs or the UN, they sue them. They get sued by them. If, for example, they're running security operations and they have to kill like a gang member or something like that, which happens. In fact, we have footage of one of the incidents. If, for example, you have cartel members in the Darien Gap raping, killing, and robbing, Centerfront will go in there and, of course, fight back. If they overstep any boundaries, the NGOs or the UN will go after Centerfront. And so some of these organizations say that they're concerned of these groups, these globalist groups, even, for example, members of it running in their elections and gaining positions of power. They're concerned about their own sovereignty. And for a lot of them, that they believe it's undermining their sovereignty. In terms of the interest, I don't know. That was a question I was not able to get, and that was something I did ask. In terms of like, hey, what do you get out of it? I don't know. What we can say is they get a lot of money because, of course, as people travel through, they're being given money from the United Nations. They're giving money through the United Nations, but through U.S. government policies. We actually discussed some of the payment programs, for example, in the documentary. They give them, for example, envelopes full of cash, literal envelopes of money, or they give them these prepaid cards. And they'll argue they're not debit cards because they have limited use, but they look like debit cards. And, of course, we have footage of it as well.
What can they be used for?
They say it can only be used at certain approved shops, and so they limit where you can spend it at. But there's different claims on how accurate that actually is. That some people say you can spend it anywhere, and they also do just give them envelopes full of money. And so, for example, in the Embera village, we asked the Embera Indians. That was the village you saw just on the mouth of the Darien Gap. It's an Indian village, the Embera Indians, and so they bring the illegal aliens on these boats. They call them piraguas, and they bring them to the Embera Indian village, which has been converted into this migrant camp. That is normally an Indian village, as are several of the camps actually. And of course, United Nations has set up shop there. They have the facilities, and of course, you have Centerfront doing security. We were talking to the Indians on how much they charge, and they're charging $75 per head to, again, get on the piragua from the Darien Gap to that particular Indian village. And, you count it, they're making $7,000, $10,000 a day per piragua, per one. And so for them, they're making insane amounts of money in a very poor area. And so, economically, they're benefiting from it. Then, of course, the illegal aliens, they pay for the buses. I don't know about all the countries, but at least in Panama, the buses aren't free. If you want to hop that bus and get a ride to Costa Rica, going through Panama, you have to pay them. There were people saying they were stranded because they didn't have the money to pay for the bus. They said we're stuck in the camp. You might have seen in the documentary there were people on the other side of the fence who were saying, that they live in the toilet, was their own words, and they said that there's these vultures there that were like trying to bite the children and stuff. They were really worried actually. But we talked to Centerfront. They said, well, they'll keep them there for a while, and eventually they'll let them go anyways. But there's money involved, and they get a lot of money from these individuals.
Oh, so that's fascinating. So what you're saying, because I thought, okay, out of these 5 nations, maybe Mexico is a bit difficult because it's so big, and their federalist government is very weak. So you could theoretically say, well, the cartels are doing it because it's outside of the purview of the federal government. Okay, but then Nicaragua, Costa Rica, I thought all it would take would be one nation to just say, hey, enough of this.
So on that note, Nicaragua is not part of the Global Compact for Migration. Okay. What we were told is that in Nicaragua, there's human trafficking organizations that handle their route. And so rather than go through the government there, you're going through human traffickers. And so, but there is a system set up for it. That'd be interesting as a follow-up investigation, what is the agreement of Nicaragua allowing this pass-through while not joining the Global Compact for Migration? Because there obviously is some kind of an agreement in place, or they just deport them. But again, part of the route established by United Nations requires, and this is the other thing, part of the route they've established requires the use of human traffickers. And so the human traffickers are actually part of the system. They're part of the program, at the very least in Nicaragua and in some of the junctures of the U.S.-Mexico borders. I mentioned not all of the junctures are controlled by the cartels, but a lot of them are. And if you want to go through the cartels, they'll charge you between $5,000 and $10,000. I've heard different amounts. A lot of times they'll say on paper it's $5,000. Once you actually get to the route, they might tell you, hey, the money's changed, it's $10,000 now, and they will kill people if they can't pay, or if they refuse to do work for the cartels, because you could say, well, I can't pay now, but I'll do work for you. That means that once you're in the United States, you're selling drugs, you're in prostitution, or you're making money, maybe stealing or something like that, and you have to send it back to the cartels, or oftentimes they'll kill your family or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Who are the people who are actually making their way through the Darien Gap and up through those 5 nations up to the U.S.? Because, well, just to preface that question, is it people from South America who are all kind of being funneled into Panama? Because I can imagine, like, if you're coming from Africa, Haiti, even China, you mentioned pretty largely in your documentary, I would imagine you would just go into Mexico. You would skip all this hassle.
That was a question I had too, because I was like, why are they going so far south? Like, why would they just willingly abuse themselves like that? Basically. And what I was told was they go further south because of a few reasons. One is because a lot of the routes going into these countries are controlled by human traffickers. And if you want to go to the safer routes, it costs more money. It's a money thing. If you want to go the safe route, you have to pay the premium price. And so it's like they have packages, right? In fact, even in the documentary, we showed clips. One of the cartels actually had a commercial aimed at Chinese, illegal immigrants, advertising to them. And they have pictures of like families and stuff, and they're being like human trafficked by like armed cartel guys, like in the video. But they make it look like it's a family vacation, basically. If you have the money, you can go the safe route. But if you don't have the money, you have to go further and further south. And so what I was told was so first of all, if you're in South America, you're going to go through the Darien Gap because that's just the route. Yeah. If you're in South America, you go through the gap. You can technically take boats around, but those are the premium prices. Those cost a lot more money, and that is controlled territory by cartels. And so if you try to get through without paying them, they will kill you, right? So they control the territory. That is cartel territory. And they're not going to let you just pass through on your own. The Darien Gap is the more dangerous route, kind of like the free route, I guess you could call it. But if you go, the other issue too is from countries like China and Africa and so on, some of the countries, they don't give visas. Because that's a question I heard too, is, well, how do they come from China without getting a visa? That's why some of them go either into Colombia or Honduras or one of these countries, is because they don't require visas. So you can travel to no visa countries, and then you can travel north. But again, if you have enough money for the human traffickers, for the luxury routes, those are the safer ones, and they do that too.
Oh, that's fascinating. The money component of it, in terms of the envelopes full of cash and the prepaid so-called debit cards, let's just call them debit cards for honesty, because that's essentially what they are. I mean,
well, that's the funny thing. There were like fact checks saying, oh, they're not debit cards. They have another word for them, but they're basically debit cards.
Well, they're saying, from what you described, it seems like SNAP EBT cards in America, where it's like food, like a food card that you can use only on certain things.
That's pretty accurate, I think. Yeah.
So that money is coming from the United Nations, right?
The United Nations, and so recently, in fact, because in some ways I feel that I was a little too far ahead of the curve on my first investigation, because a lot of people just had trouble believing that the United Nations is running the show. Like it was a little too far ahead of the curve, because I was saying that like 2-3 years ago. Recently, in the past maybe 6 months, other media have begun covering it, because they've been looking at the United Nations budget, and the United Nations budget actually just discloses it, like they say it. And they say they're working with like 270 NGOs in some cases, depending on the program. So, it's becoming known now, right? It's becoming understood on a mainstream level. Yes, this is happening, but there's still a lot of questions of like, well, how does it work? What are the systems in place? Which was, of course, with this documentary, what I'm hoping to show people, and what I do believe we do show.
Well, let me ask you the question of incentive structures, because I know, like for instance, in the debate here in the United States about voting, right? They say, well, one of the arguments against having like even a voter ID law in place is that it disproportionately affects minorities and black people, because if you look at a chart, even though like 99% of the population has IDs, out of that 1% who doesn't have IDs, it's disproportionately black people as opposed to their percentage of the population. So it's like, well, you can't have this law in place because it disproportionately affects black people. And so that signifies to me that people understand second and third order effects of things, right? That it's like, okay, you might have something in place and an unintentional consequence of that might be something else, or something else even from that. So then you have this superstructure that's been put in place by the UN. You cross the Darien Gap, and right there, nice UN facilities, they give you food, they give you shirts, they give you clothing, they give you baby formula, they give you cash, they give you debit card equivalents. Is there no thinking that this is going to encourage more migration, or is that the point?
That seems to be kind of the unspoken agreement. Because what these people in these countries are being told is, hey, come to America, you get a free house. You get to go to America, which is literally a dream for some of these people. Like, I was actually talking to some guys, down in Panama. I was with a Mexican journalist, Oscar Ramirez, who you saw me interviewing. He's from Mexico. I was talking to them, and I was like, well, how is this viewed? And he was saying, America's the dream. All of the media, all the movies, all the entertainment, America is the dream. All of them dream about going to America.
Well, that's the people, but what about the UN? I mean, they must know what they're doing.
Well, so here's the thing with that. And so as soon as you start creating incentive structures, as you mentioned, that, hey, not only do you get to meet your dream, but they will facilitate it. They'll protect you to an extent. There are some dangers with it, mostly just in the Darien Gap, honestly, right? After you get through the Darien Gap, it's just a long bus ride, basically. Like, after you get through the Darien Gap, it's a long bus ride. And, maybe you need $5,000 or $10,000, depending on which routes you take. Like, as long as you understand that, people get loans from their families. Their family members in America will wire them money, which is actually technically illegal, because then you're paying for human trafficking, which, technically it's illegal, which raises legal questions about the United Nations, the U.S. government programs as well. But there's an unspoken element to it, right? They open up the money. They make it clear that they're going to provide money for it. They have boards. In fact, I saw them personally, even advertising the routes, showing people where the checkpoints are, what the entire route is to the United States. Like, it's all there. And so they're doing everything other than basically say, hey, come to America. But actually in Latin America, you do actually have like traffickers and so on advertising it. And so, it's kind of like saying, well, I didn't tell the dogs to come eat, but I rang the dinner bell telling them it's time to eat. At what point do you say that you facilitated it versus just created the structure, to allow it to happen? And, without a doubt, they're offering a lot of incentives to people. They're making the incentives very noticeable. There's a lot of word of mouth.
But why? Like, what's the ultimate goal?
That was a question I wanted to answer that they're not saying. I can say, so I looked into that, right? If you go on the United Nations website, if you go to the website, for example, for the Global Compact on Migration, you will see they're promoting, for example, the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, right? It's the 17 sustainability goals of the United Nations. And so based on that, you would assume it's part of that program, right? They're trying to create this kind of new world vision. And there's two things that stood out to me. One of them is what they call global equity. And this is what global equity means. It means equity, equality of outcome globally. Global socialism, in other words. And so the thinking is this, and I mean, I've heard this expressed. For example, Joe Rogan even had a guest on defending it one time. There's like, we become life becomes a little worse here. Life becomes a little better there. That's the way they sell it, right? And the idea is this. As long as you're promising a better life somewhere, they'll facilitate it, they'll pay you, they'll make your journey as easy as possible. You get bus rides, you get free food, you get cash handouts. They'll help you. You know what I mean? They'll facilitate it. And once you arrive, hey, what's waiting for you? It's a free hotel room or free house, depending on where you're at, is what they're being promised at least. Free food, and they're complaining that the houses and food aren't good enough. You know what I mean? Because they're like, oh, I was misled. The quality of the housing and food that you're giving me for free is not good enough. You know what I mean? Like, that's the complaint they have, not that they're not getting it. But if you look at the United Nations website, again, Global Compact for Migration, they talk about global equity. And equity is this, again, as I was explaining. The idea is the poor people, the people who are not doing well in the countries they're in, they will be the ones seeking a better life. And as long as they believe they can have a better life in the United States, and they're currently having, there's an incentive to go. For example, you take the people who are well-to-do. And honestly, quality of life in Panama was not bad. We went around the city. There's some really nice areas. Like, it was not a bad place to live. There's a lot of American expats there, and they're like, this is the best place on earth. Like, it's nice, actually, as are many countries in that region. But what you're getting instead are the criminals looking for a new start, or looking to take advantage of kind of the loose on crime laws we have here, especially as they have crackdowns in Venezuela. As long as they have crackdowns in, for example, Argentina and Ecuador starting now, and for example with MS-13 in El Salvador, there's countries cracking down on the gangs. And so if you're a gang member and you're threatened to go, take your shirt off and hug a guy laying over him for the next 12 hours a day for the rest of your life, like, what are you going to do? You're going to run. You're going to flee the country. This is offering them a new start, basically. And a lot of them, the gang members, are coming here, as Trump has been saying. But the majority of them are going to be the poor people. They're people who are not living good lives in the country they're in. Where they're being promised, if you imagine you're getting like $75 a week, maybe, and someone's offering you a $10,000 prepaid card if you come to New York. What are you going to do? You hear they're putting aside $400 million, for the illegal immigrants in some states just recently. Like, they see that money and they're like, you're offering more money than I will see in my entire life just to illegally enter your country. Yeah, I'll hop on that bus. And that process is going to continue until you reach a state where quality of life here can offer no more than quality of life there. Because as long as there's an incentive, they're going to come here. As long as they look and see that, hey, life is better there than it is here, they're going to come. And that's what global equity looks like. It means these countries become a little less poor, right? There's a little less crime because they've sent their poor people and their criminals here, and life here becomes a little bit worse. We have more crime, we have the gangs in those countries, we have the people who they couldn't take care of, and it also creates this like socialist superstructure to take care of them. So that is what global equity looks like.
Basically, bringing everything to the lowest common denominator.
Flattening of the world. And then, of course, we looked into the programs they talk about as well, which is the multipolar world order, which is, of course, basically the United States and Western Europe, the system of liberal democracy, as it's been called, right? The system of government we've had post-World War II, the peace under America, the Pax Americana, this idea that humans are imbued with God-given rights, based on the American idea, and that if you violate that, the United States might sanction you. That's the Pax Americana. There are countries, Vladimir Putin is talking about this very actively. Xi Jinping, in fact, is one of the biggest promoters of this idea. He's given speeches on it. They talk about a multipolar world order led by the China model. World Economic Forum is big on it. A lot of people are promoting it. This is one of the agendas. And so when they talk about that, what does it mean? It means you have to tear down the power of the United States and Western Europe to create a global shared power structure where regional governments control the world, not the unipolar world order of the United States. You create a multipolar world order of global shared governance. That's what they're talking about.
Well, Josh, thank you very much. And if you're interested to learn more about how the UN is not only encouraging but actually facilitating the southern border crisis here in the U.S. and the crisis that's spreading to basically every major city in America right now, check out Weapons of Mass Migration. I'll throw the link to it down into the description box below. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.